final session this evening. So I'm Amy Baylor, I'm in the Political Science Department, and just I want to echo all the thank yous to Chris for planning this event, and I'll add my thank you for including us political scientists in the School of Public Policy. And I see this as a political scientist panel here. We're both political scientists. And unlike David Burnell, I did not memorize all of Tim's accomplishments, so I am going to read a little bit. But I want to let you know that even though he's British and lives in Australia, he is qualified to speak about American foreign policy, largely because he's written a few books on the topic, including Turf Wars, the Clinton Administration in North Ireland, out of Ashgate in 2004, and co-author of the book called After Bush, The Case for Continuity in American Foreign Policy, at Cambridge Press in 2008, which was the winner of a Richard Newsett Book Prize and is one of the biggest selling international security texts of 2008. And we'll have a new book coming out in 2014, After the Cold War, American Foreign Policy in a New World. So I think he's generally qualified to give this talk today. In addition, he is a regular commentator for Sky News and ABC TV radio in Australia, the BBC and Al Jazeera in the UK, and C-SPAN, who will be here later this evening, and NPR in the US, and his editorials have run in The Age, The Guardian, The Herald Sun, and The Wall Street Journal. So with that, I will pass this over to our very well-prepared presenter, Dr. Timothy Lynch.
Thanks, Amy. That's very good of you. I always, with an introduction like that, I start to look forward to hearing what I'm going to say. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely delighted to be here in Oregon. I've never been to Oregon before. I've lived in Kansas and I've lived in Boston, but never got to Oregon. I had to wait a long time to get that visa, and I'm absolutely delighted that Chris was able to set up this conference. One of my better decisions in life was recruiting Chris as one of the editors for the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Military and Diplomatic History. He was sold to me on the basis that he's on the left, but he's a man that you can do business with. And he's treated David and I with far greater deference than we actually deserve, certainly than I deserve, and I'm very grateful for him for setting up this conference. I'm immeasurably better as a scholar because of my association with the three people that I work with on these two volumes: Danny Holtz, David Milne, and Chris McKnight-Nichols. My name is Tim Lynch, and I'm a political scientist. There, I said it. In some ways, my problem with political science is that it lacks firm historical knowledge. That political scientists have this tendency to develop theories where historians develop knowledge. So I think the best political scientists are those that understand history and use history. There's really no other data set that we can use in the absence of historical knowledge, and that's really explains part of my intellectual professional motivation for editing these encyclopedias. Now, I'm probably at this point the political scientist extant that has there is no greater living political scientist with a fuller understanding of American history than me. That speaks to the problem with political science rather than to my genius. What I'd like to do is present to you, in the time I have, three arguments. They're arguments I think I thought were true before I came to this project, but they were certainly arguments that I think were validated by my exposure to the project. And they are arguments, and I'm not positing them to you as truth, and I'd like your response to them. They are, first of all, that American foreign policy is appropriately conditioned by a competitive process. This is a good thing. Competition works. The second argument is that this has great utility, that over the long term, American foreign policy, though not the only explanation for American success, has worked, has taken the United States from irrelevance to almost everything in the space of nearly 27 decades. And thirdly, that American foreign policy is far more marked by continuity than it is by disruption and change. Let me make these three arguments to you. The first, the competition is basic to the function of American foreign policy. It's almost a truism, isn't it, that the Constitution privileges a conflictual, disputatious process in order to get legislation. The American founders developed a system born of their fundamental distrust of political power. Political power is a great problem of modern democracy, particularly in democracy where the tyranny of the majority is an ever-present threat. So they divide power up. You have the most dangerous branch, that which is connected most closely to the people, the Congress, is divided in two to prevent the combinations of majorities which would oppress minority rights. In foreign policy, the power to make war is separate from the power to declare it. The President has the power to make war, but Congress has the power to declare the wars the President makes. From the most mundane to the most awesome of political power, there is a separation in the control of the power. Competition is expected. If men and women are engaged in competing for power, they don't get to spend time exercising it. So better good legislation fail than bad legislation pass. It was Edwin S. Corwin, a great constitutional scholar, writing in the middle 20th century, described the US Constitution as an invitation to struggle for the control of American foreign policy. The other systems, other rival systems, the French, the British to an extent, the Russian, the Chinese, I'll come back to this, but let me suggest now that these were predicated on an opposite conception. Invest all the political power in one class or race or elite, and you'll get foreign policy efficacy. The American experiment is founded on an opposite understanding, that if you invest too much political power, domestic and foreign, in one place, you will have problems. So there is this incentive to compete for power. Perhaps the finest expression of this, although perhaps not technically a foreign policy issue, was the Civil War and Lincoln's construction of a team of rivals. This notion of creative tension producing appropriate, good policy. And we see in the history of American foreign policy an ebb and flow in where foreign policy power resides. In periods of great national security crisis, you get the legitimation of presidential power in a way that you don't when the foreign policy waters are quiet. Then Congress becomes much more assertive. I don't want to overplay the kind of natural process that the Constitution embodies, but in some ways that's exactly what it is. It's a machine that responds to external stimuli. It's not a system predicated on accident and force, to quote Publius. It's one which uses reflection and choice. It is a machine. It's an experiment. It doesn't posit universal truths in how government should operate, but only in what the ends of government should be. So competition is basic, get used to it. I know liberals moan and worry about gridlock and the shutting down of government. In some ways, these are the prices you pay for a competitive system. Much rather have a government that shuts down than a government which tyrannises. The founders, I think, we can have this argument, but I will be right. The founders would much rather have inefficient government than government which does too much. God give us inefficient government. Govern, the Chinese aphorism, govern a small country as you would cook a small fish. Hardly at all. That seems to me to compute far more with the founders' design. Now, this is a problem when it comes to foreign policy, because slowness of foreign policy, unlike slowness of domestic public policy, can spell disaster. If you've got Native Americans, the French, the Spanish, the British taking chunks out of you, you can't afford to spend time deliberating on the course of action. You must respond. So the separation of power and the competitive process is particularly problematic when it comes to foreign policy. And here my second argument presents itself. Alexis de Tocqueville, the greatest foreign observer of the United States, was right about everything except this one point. He predicted, and it's a book full of prescience, Democracy in America. Repays rereading. It's just a wonderful, wonderful work. He predicted that the democratic character of the American regime would render it vulnerable to the depredations of autocratic systems. Democracy is not able to mobilize quickly to defend itself against monarchy. Monarchy is one man, as it was in 1776. One man organizes the machinery of foreign policy. In the United States, whilst there is a president, the president is obliged to negotiate his power. This is a great problem for Alexis de Tocqueville. This will render the United States vulnerable to the attacks, physical attacks of autocratic regimes. But of course he's wrong about this. We know that the United States, after a 19th century, I mean, caricature to an extent, but it captures a certain truth, a 19th century spent ducking and weaving and avoiding the great power competitions of the great powers of Europe, in the 20th century becomes the state on which the future of Europe and the future of Japan depend. All the monarchical, centralized systems either fall in the face of American power or fall in the face of American military power, physically. There's something about American democracy and its competitive system which works, and works far better than the rival systems. The French, I mean, imagine the French antipathy towards the American experiment. It was supposed to be the French at this point which controlled the world. We're all supposed to be speaking French, drinking red wine, because these experiments began at the same time, but the French one foundered. France exists as a nation state because of American power. It's a living, 1944-45 is a living testament to that aphorism that no people ever forgive a great favour. French have never forgiven the United States for saving them. But again, a French Revolution which privileged power, placed power in one place, and it was the undoing of the experiment. The remarkable thing about the Russian Revolution and the communist experiment that followed is just how far it was able to survive, given the absurd nature of its composition, with a series of geriatric leaders invested with supreme absolute foreign policy power, again crumbled in the face of a far more flexible, adaptive American system. So if we look at the competitors, I'm not asking you to laud American power as in some way a manifestation of political perfection, but in some ways it's been much more effective than the regimes which were pledged to its destruction, the Soviet Union being the prime example. And it works, and I'm not the first man to observe this, it works because it doesn't privilege one particular style or ideology in its foreign policy. The American system is a recurrent debate between isolationists, internationalists, liberals, realists, conservatives. In some eras, there is dominance of one, but that dominance is very quickly replaced. This is a good thing. Tocqueville said this makes it cacophonous. It doesn't. It makes it orchestral, symphonic, when it works well, cacophonous when it doesn't. It's the multitudinous nature of American foreign policy that actually contributes to its strength rather than its weakness. It's multiple voices all being able to plug in to the debate that has given it a durability that its competitors simply did not have. And look, this is a very crude measure, but I think it's a very good one. The United States went from irrelevance, a distant trading outpost in British North America 226 years ago, to being not just a global superpower, but the most important political, economic, cultural, social, military power in the history of the world. Now, I know those who want to resist the attribution of this to the American experiment will insist that it's the weather, it's the climate, it's the the fact that the land is arable. Well, of course, these aren't insignificant factors. But the political system also has some role here as well. If you're going to afford explanatory power to these, to chance, to providence, you must also afford some explanatory weight to design. So it went from zip, diddly squat, to everything. A crude measure, but I think a very effective one, and its foreign policy has got something to do with that. Third argument. It overhangs all this, and it's the argument that American foreign policy represents far more continuity than it does change or disruption. We have, I think, a simplistic faith that every 4 or 8 years we will get foreign policy revolution in the United States. And Barack Obama ran on this. I think if he's the intellectual that David Mill contends, he never believed it. Foreign policy changes only very slowly. It's a glacial process. There's a Romanian proverb which tells us that a change of government is the joy of fools, but expecting transformation in foreign policy according to an electoral calendar is naive. Let me illustrate this, and I think it's capable of illustration across the span of American history, but certainly the history post Second World War. In 1952, America was presented with a clear choice between an old, failing foreign policy which was ceding huge swathes of territory to the Red Menace, and a foreign policy which would halt this, which would roll back the red tide. Dwight Eisenhower presented his foreign policy in almost entirely oppositional terms to Harry S. Truman. And what did we get through the 1950s? We got something called a new look, but in terms of substance, it was almost identical. A bit more bluff and bluster, a bit more rhetoric, but essentially the same foreign policy continued. In 1964, LBJ warned the electorate that if they elected Barry Goldwater that year, 500,000 men would end up in Vietnam. Well, 2 years later, after the Johnson landslide, 500,000 men plus ended up in Vietnam. Jimmy Carter. Barack Obama is the 44th president of the United States, but only if you include Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, despite a very problematic legacy, in some ways, his transformation halfway through his term, when he realised the Soviet Union was more problematic than he'd been led to believe, changes tack. He starts the defence build-up that Ronald Reagan inherits. But it's Ronald Reagan we think of as the warmonger, as the guy that escalated. Oh, it began under the preceding Democratic administration. And of course, the one we know well and have lived through and liberals want to try and deny. It seems to me that in 2008, Barack Obama's very thin national security credentials were not interrogated because he bought into the Bush doctrine, hook, line and sinker. He accepted the number one national security threat facing the United States is the nexus between terrorism and technology. The central purpose of American counterterrorism is to prevent the bad guys getting hold of the bad stuff. I do this in some of my recent work. Look at the rhetoric of these two men, despite one being syntactically challenged and the other being a great rhetorician. How they frame the nature of the threat is essentially identical. We were promised a foreign policy revolution. Certainly the base like to plug this notion that having a half-white, half-black president that was from Hawaii and Indonesia would presage a great cosmopolitan shift in American foreign policy. It didn't. In some ways, Obama has out-Bushed Bush. The use of drones, the invasion of a Muslim country, regime change in that Muslim country that came without a UN resolution to sanctify it. The invasion was sanctified by the UN, not pulling Gaddafi out of a hole in the ground and executing him. The use of drones. This is the guy that killed Osama bin Laden. Bush was ridiculed for his Wild West rhetoric, bringing him back dead or alive, and yet it was the effete, cosmopolitan, internationalist Barack Obama that brought him back dead. So continuity marks American foreign policy, and let me quickly suggest why that might be the case. And this is not an argument that foreign policy doesn't change. Why would scholars study something that's essentially static? That's not the argument. But it's very slow to change in periods of national security crisis, which tend to engender consensus. We are still fighting a war on terror. Obama refuses to call it that, but in some ways he's fought it far more competently than George Bush. It rests on a consensus across parties. This consensus is robust, as it was in the Cold War, which is why you tend to get continuity in national security policy more than you get change and shifts. The Vietnam War was so violent socially at home because it was seen as a violation of the consensus. It was a tactical misstep within a consensus about where the strategy should be going. Barack Obama is not a pacifist. He resisted the Iraq War not because its rationale was faulty, but because it was tactically the wrong step to take. The strategy was not met by that tactical move, which is why he's been perfectly prepared to escalate and surge in much the same way that George Bush has been was willing to do. So continuity in eras of consensus is to be expected, and it's naive, I think, to expect fundamental change and revolution. Where does this leave us all? Well, let me recap the arguments I've presented. I've made the pitch, and it's in the title of the talk today, that American foreign policy represents far more success, ignored success, than it does failure. And I'm quite prepared to stick to that. The measure is crude, but the United States went from being irrelevant to being the most important nation in world history. And that has something to do with its foreign policy. It doesn't guarantee perfection in the execution thereof, but it does mean it's capable of adaptation in a way that rival systems simply were not able. It could stomach the loss of North Korea, of Vietnam, of Iraq, if you want to use that as an example of failure, and still function. Barack Obama, I think, though this may be tangential, is testament to the enduring power of transformation in the American system. It's flexible, it's adaptable. All the other rival systems have shown themselves not to be. And I think it behoves the historian, and certainly the political scientist, to recognise this line of success in the history of American foreign policy. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.